didn't want to leave it in the street. So they quickly carried it into a church and not just left it in the vestibule. They went up the center aisle. They put the body in front of the altar. They covered it with a sheet. And on the sheet, they placed his stole and his fire badge. And then they knelt down and they thanked God.
Also laid to rest today, former federal prosecutor and conservative commentator Barbara Olson. The wife of the U.S. Solicitor General Theodore Olson was among the 64 passengers and crew members on the American Airlines flight that crashed into the Pentagon. Barbara was eulogized by Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas, who said she had a wonderful spirit. She was also a good friend to all of us here at CNN. My colleague Greta Van Susteren is standing by here in Washington. For the next half hour, she will focus on the investigation into Tuesday's terrorist attacks. Greta?
Wolf, investigators are connecting the dots, and the line still points at Osama bin Laden. President Bush today called bin Laden, quote, the prime suspect. But there are still plenty of unanswered questions about Tuesday's terrorist attacks on the U.S. CNN's Mike Betcher is in Atlanta with the very latest on the investigation. Mike, let me first start right with the most important question. Is it all over, the terrorism on Tuesday? Has it stopped, or should we still have fear? I guess we've lost contact with Mike Betcher. When he becomes available, we'll bring him right back. But as details of the terrorism plot unfold, ordinary people are discovering to their horror that they knew some of the hijackers. One man not only knew a couple of them, he helped teach them to fly. CNN's John Zarella has his story.
And this terrible act that
Henry George is carrying a terrible weight, a burden he says he will carry to his grave.
I don't have an extensive vocabulary where I can come up with words to express, how you feel to have been, part of this thing.
Last December 29th and 30th, at his Opelika Flight Training School, George gave two Middle Eastern men some basic lessons in a simulator on how to fly a jet aircraft. The two men were Mohammed Atta and Marwan al-Shari. Federal law enforcement agents believe Atta and al-Shari were likely flying the planes that hit the World Trade Center towers. The story they gave their flight instructor was this.
They were on their way home, and they wanted the exposure to jet flying, or an introduction to jet flying, because they were hoping to get a job with their airline in their country.
George says Egypt was mentioned once or twice. No less than 12 of the 19 suspected hijackers lived in South Florida for a time. Federal agents believe at least 4 of the pilots trained here, spending tens of thousands of dollars, mostly cash, on flying lessons. Florida made sense. Flight training schools are everywhere. It's a huge business. They could get all the training they needed and never spend too much time in one place. Atta and al-Shari first surfaced at Huffman Aviation in Venice, on Florida's west coast, where they took lessons. That was 6 months before they showed up at Henry George's flight school, which wasn't their final stop. One of the two, Atta, as recently as 3 weeks ago, rented this plane at Palm Beach Flight Training.
He was a normal person, very well spoken. He just said he wanted to build 100 hours and he wanted to fly a low-wing aircraft, so I showed him our airplanes, and he decided that he wanted to fly this one right here.
The Opelika flight instructor had a similar experience with Atta and al-Shari. They were low-key, and in the simulator there was nothing special about their flying abilities.
What I can recollect from my memory is that we mostly did turns and a couple of approaches. I don't think we did any more than that.
What they didn't do, George says, is practice how to land. John Zarella, CNN, Miami.
Joining me from Fort Myers, Florida, is someone else who has suddenly discovered you cannot tell a terrorist from an ordinary guy. Rudy Deckers is president of Huffman Aviation, a flight school that John Zarella just mentioned. Rudy, which terrorist or which one of the suspected terrorists did you come in contact with?
Good evening. I've spoken with Mahmoud Atta and with Maureen Hashimi.
Let me first talk about Mr. Atta. What was it that, was there anything unusual about him to you?
The only thing that was unusual on him is that when I saw him, I didn't like him at all. He had a behavior that he felt he was above everybody. He was not acting normal by making contact with people. He was there apparently with our flight school to obtain training, and he was not socializing with anybody. As a matter of fact, he was rude to everybody.
When did you first meet Mr. Atta?
When I meet Atta, is that what you said?
Yeah, when did you first meet him?
He came into our facility July 3rd, 2000. He left January 3rd this year.
And Mr. Ashari, was there anything unusual about him?
No, he was a likely young man. He was very friendly, laughing. He enjoyed flying. He was more normal, to say. Of course, we don't call him normal anymore for what they did, but they were not socializing with anybody else. The two stuck together and didn't socialize with any other students. We are used to that with the Middle East students, though.
When Mr. Atta was training, did he get extensive training with you?
When Atta walked into our facility and checked it out, he showed that he already had a private pilot license obtained with another school somewhere in Florida.
So what did he want from you?
I can't hear you.
What did he want from you? What kind of training did he want from you?
Okay. They obtained both their private, commercial, single-engine, multi-engine training. They did the multi-engine training in a Piper Seneca 2. It's a six-seater, two-engine. It's a very small airplane.
Now, Rudy, is the training that they received on a small airplane, was it enough to steer a big aircraft to a target?
Well, no, I have said no, although I'm not a professional on the big airplanes, only on the small airplanes. We checked with some captains of airlines, and they said no. We heard indeed that they went somewhere South Florida to obtain more training in a simulator, and as I understand, they trained in a 737, and that's where they get some more experience. But with our licenses, they're only at the start to begin to fly with other equipment, but they need to get training.
Looking back, Rudy, is there any sort of thing that you sort of think to yourself tonight, oh, this should have been a tip to me, or a clue that there might be something afoot?
No. We found nothing. Even now we know what they did. We couldn't find anything that was a sense of anything. Atta was just not a likable person. We couldn't find anything. I heard you saying or one of your colleagues saying that they paid cash with other facilities. At our facility, they paid with checks as they were going. They paid a $1,000 check, 2 weeks later another $1,000 check. There was nothing unregular. All the students that come over to the facility from overseas, they come there to obtain the commercial license to fly back home in an airline. And there was nothing, absolutely nothing, that we had to fly, any clue what they were doing.
All right, Rudy Deckers, thank you for joining me this evening.
Okay.
The terrorists not only attended flight school in Florida, they rented cars there. Brad Warwick now knows he did repeat business with one of them. He joins me from Fort Lauderdale. Brad, with whom did you do business?
Both Mohammed Atta and his cousin, Marwan.
And did you notice anything unusual about them?
No, the funny part is everything was totally on the up and up. All their information matched. They had driver's license, Florida driver's license, all-state insurance, addresses on everything matched. They seemed to be a normal customer with not a very heavy accent at all.
Brad, now the first time you rented a car, as I know, to Mr. Atta, it was in August of this year, is that right?
That's right. August 6th was the very first time.
How is it that you even remember renting a car to him, since I assume you rent lots of cars?
Well, the funny coincidence is I was the person that rented the car to him each time he was in, and I closed the contract each time he was in, except for the very last time on Sunday. I was not working that day, and somebody else took care of the cousin when the cousin returned the car. But other than that, it was myself all the time.
Did you actually have a conversation with him and spend some time talking to him while he's at the counter, or was it strictly business?
No, we didn't engage in any personal conversation as what he was doing or where he was going, other than he told me he was going over to the West Coast, and he actually even called me from the West Coast once when he was over there. But other than that, it was all strictly normal business.
Did he tell you his occupation?
No, he did not.
Did you have any indication that there might be something afoot with him?
No, actually, he spoke to be a very intelligent man and conducted himself as such, and I thought he was just a businessman that was doing some traveling in the state of Florida, and also when he left one time he returned a card, said he was going up to New York and he was coming back in a few days, and he did, and started another contract. So I just thought he was another businessman.
Was it weird that he started one contract, ended it, and then started another one? Was that unusual at all?
No, because he left to go up to New York and he came back.
What about the second car that he rented? I understand he put about 1,000 miles on it within about 2 weeks.
Actually, no, he put 1,900 miles on it over the course of 2 weeks, and that was the car he took over to Venice. He called me from Venice to let me know that the service engine soon light comes on. The car needed to be serviced and wanted to know if that was something you should be alarmed about. And I said, no, just let me know when you bring the car back.
Is it unusual to put 1,900 miles on a car in that period of time or not?
Well, a local person wouldn't be, but if it's a person traveling around the strait like tourists do or business people do, I mean, it's nothing to send up a red flag of any type of alarm, because some people do rent a car to do some traveling.
What was your impression of him?
My impression of him was, number one, he was a nice, polite man. I never had any problem with him, and he was very intelligent and appeared to be a businessman.
When you read about the fact that his name, at least people believe that he was one of the hijackers, what did you think?
Well, I was shocked as the pieces of the puzzle started unfolding here, and I realized that how much we were involved in it and how much close contact I had with an international terrorist. Yeah, it was quite shocking.
And when he brought the car back, I assume there were no problems, nothing unusual whatsoever.
No, he looked out for my best interest and let me know about a car that needed to be serviced. They didn't trash the cars or abuse them at all.
All right, my thanks to Brad Warwick for joining me this evening.
You're welcome.
Joining me on the phone right now is Richard Surma. He owns a motel in Deerfield Beach, Florida. Some of the men suspected of being terrorists apparently stayed there studying flight manuals. Good evening, sir.
Good evening.
Can you tell me what you know about these suspected terrorists?
They were nice people, average acting, and pretty intelligent, I would say. And they were kept to themselves.
When did they first rent a room?
They came in August 26th for 1 week. They paid, and then they paid again another week, September 2nd. They stayed till September the 9th.
And how many men were there?
Two in one room, but one extra visitor kept visiting them every single day.
And do you know who that was?
No, it never dawned on me to ask. One time he slept there overnight just before they checked out the next day, and my wife asked him, "What are you doing here?" But then they were gentle people, so she left them alone.
Was there anything left in the room after they moved out that was unusual?
Just one utility knife, one of those razor box cutter things, and some a box of frozen food that looks like spinach, but it was in Arabic, so I didn't know what it was inside.
When you say utility knife, could you describe it more fully, please?
It was kind of thin. The newer type, not the bulky one.
Is it the kind of knife that you'd buy at your local hardware store, just a regular carpet knife or box knife?
Yes.
And has that been turned over to the FBI?
The FBI took it, put it in the bags.
And have they done sort of forensic testing of the room, or they fingerprinted the room and looked at it?
Oh, yes, they did. They sealed it off completely, and they stay here for 3 days, 3 nights, dusting and putting some violet dye on it.
All right.
There was also some things in the dumpster that they threw out. That was the thing I kept.
Which was? And what else was in the dumpster?
Well, there was flight manuals and a lot of maps from the eastern part of the United States. But there were aeronautical maps, and there was also a fuel tester. It looked like a giant syringe. And also there was a German-English dictionary and 3 martial arts books.
All right, thank you very much for joining me tonight, sir.
You're welcome.
Now to CNN's Mike Betcher in Atlanta with the very latest on the investigation. Mike, when I thought I'd contact with you before, I wanted to know the answer to the question, is the fear over? Has the terrorism on Tuesday stopped?
Well, to tell you very precisely, Greta, on Wednesday I talked to several intelligence sources who said, quote, "It's not over." And then David Ensor, our national security correspondent, took it a step further after that, and he talked to his sources who said there are still terrorist cells in this country who may be trying to launch terrorist attacks. So the bottom line, Greta, is it's not over, and it won't be over for a long time.
When you say there are terrorist cells in this country, is there any more information in terms of geography, where they might be, what they might attempt to do? Are we learning anything at all?
What I am trying to piece together is the potential, and I'm still working on this, but it appears clear that there was a concerted effort to insert cells over the past few years into this country. That seems obvious, but it wasn't the normal tit-for-tat sort of terrorism. This was a much more concerted effort. How many? Numbers? I don't know. These people operate in what are called sleeper cells, a lot of them. They go over somewhere else overseas for training, come back here, get additional training, and like the pilots in this whole terrorist act, and then they lead normal lives. And then someone activates them, and they commit their deeds. So, you know, it's a tough thing for the FBI, for the CIA, for any of these people to try to know exactly what they're doing, because it is so closely knit, these particular sleeper cells, and a lot of them don't know each other anyway.
Mike, what about the people who are in custody? What do we know about them?
Well, there are two material witnesses now, one in custody, one not. The one in custody was arrested at Thursday when the airport reopened at JFK. He was on board an aircraft, and he was caught with a fake pilot's ID. He wasn't in the cockpit, he was a passenger. And then you see the two people up here on the screen. They are they are not material witnesses, rather. They are two men who were taken off a train in Fort Worth, Texas, one of 25 people now held by the Immigration and Naturalization Service who are being questioned by the FBI. On these two were found box cutters. Now, similar weapons authorities believe were used in the hijacking of the 4 aircraft.
Is there a certain strategy that the investigators are following in trying to track these people down?
The strategy they have adopted early on is to look to the past to try to figure out what happened this time. Because bin Laden, even though this is a much bigger operation, bin Laden operates pretty consistently in the way he organizes his troops. There is this manual, which we have in our possession, that was introduced in the embassy bombing trials in New York. And they follow that pretty closely in terms of operations, communications, transportation. And so they've gone back to past cases like Khobar Towers, and they've also gone to the USS Cole bombing. And in terms of that, the Cole, they found a connection between a couple of the people, the hijackers in this most recent incident, and the Cole bombing. The CIA apparently had surveillance set up in Kuala Lumpur on a suspect in the Cole bombing. One of the people who was the hijackers who crashed the plane into the Pentagon was seen in that surveillance video. A couple of weeks before Tuesday's incident, the FBI was told by the CIA to be on the lookout for these two, for one guy and his associate. Both of them were on the American Airlines plane that went down, and they opened an investigation. Now, what happened after they opened that investigation, we don't know.
All right, Mike Boettcher, thank you very much for joining us tonight. Almost 5,000 people are unaccounted for in New York. The crushing agony of not knowing what has become of them has paralyzed parents, families, friends, and many Americans. CNN's Candy Crowley introduces us to one man who is living this nightmare.
Yes, Dan? Yes, this is David Vincent.
He's an Eastman Kodak executive from Webster, New York. A man with a problem to solve, a man on a mission.
How is it being set up so that I can make the best use of my time? Because you're working a timeline here. You have to get to your daughter as fast as you can.
Melissa is missing. She's a technology recruiter at Alliance Consulting.
But we know that that's 102nd floor of Tower 1.
The enormity of what's happened in David Vincent's life shows on his face, but does not slow his step.
Please take a picture. Please focus on the picture. to get her face out there so that
Working on 3 hours sleep and a couple of crackers, he protects his fondest hopes, battles his worst fears, and sometimes loses.
I don't have any video of her. To be honest with you, Melissa didn't like to be videoed. She used to holler at me every time I did. I'd give anything to have her holler at me right now.
I'd give anything, he says, to have her holler at me right now. It's a rare lapse. Mostly, there is a desperate monotony to his mission.
I know she made a 911 call at 9:02:07.
It's all that David Vincent knows about what happened to his eldest daughter. It's enough to hang hope on.
When we went back to the cell phone provider, the only thing that we had that they could tell us is that there was a 911 call made from that cell phone at 9:02, which was some 17 minutes after the jet had piled into the thing.
9:02:07. He tells it to everyone he talks to. He clings to it for dear life, because of course it is.
I need to know where she was when she made that call, because that will tell me whether she was downstairs just getting off the path and maybe in a void someplace downstairs, or whether I have to understand that she was upstairs on 102 and have to wonder whether she was able to get out or not able to get out.
By evening, David Vincent has pretty much worn out the corner of 26th and Lexington, and his cell battery is fading, so he moves on. Craig Spitzer is CEO of Alliance. 7 employees, everyone thought to be in the building that morning, are missing. He cannot, will not, bring himself to believe they're gone.
Somewhere in your head, you know they're gone, right?
I'm not going to say that to you right now.
You can't?
No, and I won't. And I won't for myself, and I won't for the people in there.
In there is a room full of people who have loved someone too long to give up so soon, and what's left after hope is unthinkable. It is why they agreed to expose this rawest of human times to the glare of the camera lens, because maybe somebody out there has information about Roland, something that will keep his brother moving.
I go to sleep with hope, I wake up with none.
And perhaps somebody saw Eric in a stairwell racing to safety.
We don't know. Maybe he's out there someplace, got hit on the head, and he doesn't know who he is. You know, maybe he's unconscious and he didn't have any identification on him.
And as it turns out, nobody can say for sure that Melissa was in the office for that 8:30 meeting.
I have to tell you, Craig, that's the best news that I could possibly hear, because what you're telling me is you can't confirm Melissa in that office space, and that's what I had to know. Yeah. That's what keeps me going.
So if you know anything about Melissa, call her father. He'd give anything to hear her holler at him again. Candy Crowley, CNN, New York.
There's no doubt about it. Americans are facing a tremendous challenge. Not just mourning our dead, not just rebuilding our cities and getting on with our lives. There also is the matter attacking global terrorism. Can we do all of that? CNN senior analyst Jeff Greenfield is in New York to remind us we have before.
Yes, Greta, it may be because of our wealth or our exuberant, often raucous culture, our love of material comfort, even our relative youth as a nation, but there is something about America that leads our adversaries over and over again to underestimate our resolve. In fact, sometimes we even underestimate ourselves. Adolf Hitler, for example, was convinced America wouldn't and couldn't defeat Nazi Germany. We were, he thought, a mongrel nation, weakened by different races and religions, and by a decadent popular culture. We could never conquer the racially pure Aryans. We did. When the Soviet Union launched the first satellite in 1957, Americans plunged into self-doubt. Soviet youth were studying physics and rocket science, Life magazine warned. Young Americans were consumed by trivial diversions. Could we withstand this threat, Life asked? We did. The Soviet Union no longer exists. Neither does Life magazine.
In Vienna, Mr. Kennedy confronted his country's major adversary.
In the early 60s, Soviet leader Khrushchev thought President Kennedy weak. Poet Robert Frost reported that Khrushchev had told him America was too liberal to fight. Khrushchev may not have said that, but he acted on that impulse when he put Soviet missiles into Cuba. The U.S. would never challenge that move, he thought. We did.
To halt this offensive buildup, a strict quarantine on all offensive military equipment under shipment to Cuba is being initiated.
My fellow Americans.
A later generation of Soviet leaders were sure America would not protect Europe with medium-range missiles. We did. And when Japan emerged as an economic superpower in the 1980s, we told ourselves that we were so consumed by short-term thinking, we would never preserve our economic supremacy. We did. And now we have new questions to answer. Can a nation where most of us have known only easy times cope with demands on our comfort, on our safety, on our families that we never imagined we would have to face? If history has the answer, we will. Greta?
In other words, Jeff, are you saying that history has shown that American will can overcome, can trump strategic obstacles?
Indeed, and can trump complacency and can trump the things we're hearing today. Admiral Yamamoto of Japan, after Japan bombed Pearl Harbor, said, "I fear we have awakened a sleeping giant." And that is the history of this country, that we can drift into isolationism, we can drift into comfort, we can turn our back on the world. But when the world reminds us that it is here, as it has done in horrifically historic ways this week, the history says America will respond. We're going to be talking about that with Senator McCain and some others later tonight. But the guide from history is pretty encouraging. The question, I suppose, is that I don't believe ever before have we gone through so sustained a period when we have faced really not much of a challenge, when we have been at peace, when we have been prosperous, when a younger generation has really not had very much asked of it. That's the question we have to answer this time around.
What happens to the critics, the dissenters, when that starts to appear on the horizon?
Yeah, see, I think actually that's an encouraging sign. I think the fact that you know, through World War II, for instance, people have this image that we marched in lockstep. There were plenty of political arguments, plenty of criticism of how Roosevelt was running the war. Roosevelt was very worried about the congressional elections of 1942 because there had been setbacks. There was some exercise in black market activity. There were not everybody pitched in, but the fact of the matter is that very kind of dissension, that cantankerousness that's so much a part of America is actually, I think, a sign of our strength. I actually look forward to the first bit of political bickering that develops, because it shows that we're feeling comfortable enough about who we are to remain Americans. And this is a country where political disagreements are, you'll pardon the expression, as American as apple pie.
You know, it's sort of interesting for me, Jeff. I didn't grow up in World War II, so I never lived through that great generation. I grew up in the Vietnam days, where there was certainly a lot of criticism and dissent, and we certainly had a divided country. Now we have such a national threat that the country seems so united, seems so different.
And I think that is really the difference between the Vietnam generation and even the whole post-war era. Korea was not a war that was fought out of any unity. There was tons of criticism of President Truman at that time because the war was stalemated. I think the difference is that what has happened here in New York and in Washington is so overwhelming that everybody has said it, and I think we started saying it Tuesday, it simply has changed us as a country. And that for once, that's not an overstatement by the media, that's fact.
And when you say it's overwhelming, I mean, it has affected everybody across this country. I had some reservists on last night, one from Milwaukee, one from San Antonio, and one from here in Washington, D.C., ready to go. I mean, it's not just a New York, Washington thing at all.
We may find out that we have lost more Americans on this day, even than in Antietam, when 7,000, I believe, died. There were 22,000 casualties in 1862. If the country doesn't change because of that, it never will. There's simply, I don't know of any way to measure this, even by history. History almost fails us as a guide. This is so overwhelming an event.
As always, thanks to CNN's Jeff Greenfield. CNN's coverage of America's new war continues in a minute with Larry King Live. I'm Greta Van Susteren in Washington, and I will be with you again tomorrow night. We leave you, though, with the haunting sights and sounds of this sad, mournful September day in New York.